Every day, across the globe, billions of people sit down to eat. A simple act. A meal with family. Breakfast before work. Lunch at school. Dinner after a long day. We rarely think about where our food comes from. The journey from farm to fork has become so distant, so invisible, that we've lost sight of what's really happening behind the scenes. But what if I told you that the very system designed to feed humanity is simultaneously destroying the planet that sustains us? What if the foods we eat every day are connected to one of the most devastating environmental crises of our time? A crisis that's accelerating climate change, poisoning our water, eliminating entire ecosystems, and creating vast dead zones in our oceans. This is not a story about a single villain or a catastrophic event. This is the story of how industrial food production, the backbone of modern civilization, became an existential threat to the natural world. And it's a story that affects every single one of us. To understand how we arrived at this crisis, we need to travel back in time. Back to the aftermath of World War II, when the world was rebuilding and populations were exploding. The challenge was monumental. How do you feed billions of people? The answer came in the form of the Green Revolution, a period from the 1950s through the 1970s when agricultural scientists developed high-yield crop varieties, synthetic fertilizers, and chemical pesticides. Norman Borlaug, an American agronomist, became the face of this revolution. His work in developing disease-resistant, high-yield wheat varieties is credited with saving over 1 billion people from starvation. In 1970, he won the Nobel Peace Prize. The promise was intoxicating. Through science and technology, we could finally defeat hunger. Large-scale mechanized farming replaced traditional agricultural methods. Monoculture, growing single crops over vast areas, became the standard practice. Chemical inputs skyrocketed. The logic was simple: maximize output, minimize cost, feed the world. And for a time, it worked. Agricultural productivity soared. Food became cheaper and more abundant than at any point in human history. The average person in a developed country could spend less than 15% of their income on food, compared to 50% or more in previous centuries. But there was a hidden cost. A debt we were accumulating that would come due with devastating consequences. Let's start with perhaps the most visible impact of industrial food production: deforestation. Every year, approximately 10 million hectares of forest disappear, an area roughly the size of Iceland. To put that in perspective, we're losing a football field of forest every single second. And the primary driver? Agriculture. Not just any agriculture, but industrial-scale farming designed to produce cheap meat, dairy, and commodity crops. The Amazon rainforest, often called the lungs of the earth, has lost roughly 17% of its forest cover in the last 50 years. The majority of this destruction is directly linked to cattle ranching and soybean cultivation. Brazil, which contains 60% of the Amazon, has seen forests cleared at an alarming rate to make room for beef production and soy farms that feed livestock around the world. But the Amazon isn't alone. In Indonesia and Malaysia, vast swaths of ancient rainforest have been destroyed to create palm oil plantations. Palm oil appears in roughly half of all packaged products in supermarkets, from cookies to cosmetics. The Sumatran tiger, orangutan, and countless other species are being pushed to the brink of extinction as their habitats are bulldozed for endless rows of oil palm trees. In Africa, the Congo Basin, the world's second-largest rainforest, faces increasing pressure from industrial agriculture. In North America, the boreal forests of Canada are threatened by agricultural expansion and the production of animal feed. Why does this matter so profoundly? Forests are not just collections of trees. They are complex ecosystems that regulate the planet's climate, produce oxygen, absorb carbon dioxide, maintain water cycles, prevent soil erosion, and harbor roughly 80% of terrestrial biodiversity. When a forest is cleared for agriculture, the carbon stored in trees and soil is released into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide and methane, powerful greenhouse gases that drive climate change. The Amazon alone stores between 150 and 200 billion tons of carbon. As it's destroyed, that carbon enters the atmosphere, accelerating global warming. But there's an even more insidious feedback loop at play. As forests disappear, rainfall patterns change. The Amazon creates its own weather system. Trees release water vapor that becomes rainfall, sustaining the forest itself. Scientists warn that we're approaching a tipping point where so much forest has been lost that the entire system could collapse, transforming the Amazon from a lush rainforest into a dry savanna. This wouldn't just be a regional catastrophe, it would have global climate implications. The indigenous peoples who have lived in these forests for millennia are also victims of this destruction. Their land rights are frequently ignored, their homes destroyed, their cultures erased, all in the name of producing cheap beef and animal feed for distant markets. Every hamburger, every gallon of milk, every piece of fried chicken has an invisible footprint stretching back to these vanishing forests. The industrialized food system has made the connection invisible, but it's very real. While deforestation happens above ground where we can see it, another crisis is unfolding beneath our feet, in the groundwater that billions of people depend on for drinking water and irrigation. Groundwater contamination from industrial agriculture is one of the most widespread and dangerous environmental problems facing humanity, yet it remains largely invisible to the public. Here's how it happens. Modern industrial farming relies heavily on chemical inputs, primarily synthetic nitrogen and phosphorus fertilizers, as well as pesticides and herbicides. These chemicals are applied in massive quantities to boost crop yields. In the United States alone, farmers apply over 20 million tons of fertilizer every year. But here's the problem. Plants don't absorb all of these chemicals. In fact, crops typically use less than 50% of the nitrogen fertilizer applied to fields. The rest. It doesn't just disappear. It seeps down through the soil, leaches into underground aquifers, and contaminates the groundwater that millions of people drink. Nitrate contamination is particularly dangerous. When nitrate levels in drinking water exceed safe limits, 10 milligrams per liter according to the EPA, it can cause serious health problems. In infants, it causes a condition called methemoglobinemia, or blue baby syndrome, which prevents blood from carrying oxygen effectively and can be fatal. But the health impacts extend far beyond infants. Recent research has linked long-term exposure to nitrate-contaminated water with increased risks of colorectal cancer, thyroid disease, and neural tube defects in developing fetuses. In America's agricultural heartland, Iowa, Nebraska, California's Central Valley, groundwater contamination is endemic. In some Iowa counties, more than half of private wells exceed safe nitrate limits. Yet testing is voluntary, and many rural residents have no idea they're drinking contaminated water. The problem is global. In China, rapid industrialization of agriculture has led to widespread groundwater contamination affecting hundreds of millions of people. In India, Punjab's Green Revolution success story has a dark side. The state's groundwater is heavily polluted with pesticides and nitrates, contributing to alarmingly high cancer rates in farming communities, earning some regions the nickname cancer villages. Europe faces similar challenges. Despite stricter regulations than other regions, countries like the Netherlands, France, and Germany struggle with agricultural contamination of groundwater, spending billions on water treatment to make it safe for consumption. Pesticides present another dimension of the problem. Atrazine, one of the most widely used herbicides in the United States, has been detected in groundwater across the Corn Belt. Research suggests it acts as an endocrine disruptor, interfering with hormonal systems in humans and wildlife. The European Union banned it in 2004 due to health concerns, but it remains widely used in the Americas. Perhaps most troubling is the persistence of these contaminants. Once groundwater is contaminated, it can remain polluted for decades or even centuries. Aquifers don't simply flush themselves clean. The chemicals linger, creating a legacy of contamination that will affect future generations long after current farming practices change. And we're not just contaminating the water, we're depleting it. The Ogallala Aquifer beneath the American Great Plains, which provides water for roughly 30% of the nation's irrigated crops, is being drained far faster than it can naturally recharge. Industrial agriculture is essentially mining fossil water, water that accumulated over thousands of years, and using it to grow crops in regions that cannot naturally sustain such intensive agriculture. The same pattern repeats globally. In India, groundwater levels are dropping precipitously due to intensive irrigation for rice and wheat. In the Middle East and North Africa, aquifers that sustained civilizations for millennia are being exhausted in a few decades. We are quite literally poisoning and emptying the wells that future generations will depend on for survival. When most people think about climate change, they picture smokestacks, cars, and power plants. Few realize that the global food system is responsible for roughly 1/3 of all human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. Industrial agriculture is not just a victim of climate change, it's one of the primary drivers. Let's break down how industrial food production generates these massive emissions. First, there's deforestation, which we've already discussed. When forests are cleared for agriculture, the carbon stored in trees and soil is released, roughly 4.6 billion tons of carbon dioxide annually. Second, synthetic fertilizer production and use. Creating nitrogen fertilizer requires enormous amounts of energy, primarily from burning fossil fuels. The process of synthesizing ammonia, the base of most nitrogen fertilizers, consumes roughly 2% of global energy production. But that's just the beginning. When nitrogen fertilizer is applied to soil, microbes convert some of it into nitrous oxide, a greenhouse gas nearly 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 100-year period. Agriculture is responsible for roughly 80% of global nitrous oxide emissions. Third, livestock production. This is where the numbers become truly staggering. There are currently about 1 billion cattle on Earth, along with billions more pigs, chickens, and other farm animals. These animals, particularly ruminants like cattle and sheep, produce methane as a byproduct of their digestion, a process called enteric fermentation. Methane is roughly 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide over a 100-year timeframe, and even more impactful in the short term. Global livestock production generates roughly 14.5% of all human-caused greenhouse gas emissions, more than the entire transportation sector combined. A single cow can produce between 70 and 120 kilograms of methane per year. With a billion cattle on the planet, that adds up to roughly 100 million tons of methane annually, just from cow burps and manure. Industrial dairy and beef operations concentrate these emissions in ways that traditional pastoralism never did. But there's more. Manure management in industrial operations creates additional methane and nitrous oxide emissions. In large concentrated animal feeding operations, CAFOs, where thousands or tens of thousands of animals are kept in confined spaces, manure is often stored in massive lagoons. These lagoons are basically giant pools of waste that emit enormous quantities of methane and ammonia. Rice cultivation, another staple of the global food system, also produces significant methane. Flooded rice paddies create anaerobic conditions that allow methane-producing bacteria to thrive. With rice feeding roughly half of humanity, the crop accounts for roughly 10% of global methane emissions. Then there's the fossil fuel consumption embedded throughout the industrial food system. Tractors, harvesters, irrigation pumps, grain dryers, processing facilities, refrigeration, transportation, the entire supply chain runs on petroleum. It's estimated that the modern food system consumes roughly 10 calories of fossil fuel energy for every 1 calorie of food energy it produces. Consider the journey of a steak from an American feedlot. Cattle are raised on feed, primarily corn and soy, that was grown using synthetic fertilizers, produced using natural gas, planted, tended, and harvested using diesel-powered machinery, then transported to processing facilities, slaughtered and packaged in refrigerated facilities, powered by electricity, often from fossil fuels. Then shipped in refrigerated trucks to grocery stores with refrigerated display cases, and finally driven home by consumers in cars. Every step burns fossil fuels. Every step emits greenhouse gases. And here's the cruel irony. The industrial food system that's driving climate change is simultaneously becoming more vulnerable to it. Extreme weather events, droughts, floods, heat waves, are becoming more frequent and severe, threatening crop yields and disrupting food supplies. The system we built to feed the world is helping to create conditions that could undermine global food security. Scientists warn that without dramatic changes to how we produce food, it will be impossible to meet international climate goals. Even if we eliminated all fossil fuel emissions from energy and transportation today, emissions from the food system alone would push us past critical temperature thresholds. The stakes couldn't be higher. Let's travel now from the fields to the sea, where one of the most disturbing consequences of industrial agriculture manifests: ocean dead zones. Stand on the shore of the Gulf of Mexico, and you might see waves lapping at the beach, seabirds diving for fish, the vitality of ocean life. But if you could travel beneath the surface to certain areas, you'd encounter something profoundly disturbing: vast regions where almost nothing lives. No fish. No crabs. No shrimp. Just empty water over lifeless seafloor. These are called hypoxic zones, or more commonly, dead zones. They form when excessive nutrients, primarily nitrogen and phosphorus from agricultural fertilizer runoff, flow into coastal waters and trigger massive algae blooms. Here's how the death spiral unfolds. Rainwater washes fertilizer from farm fields into streams and rivers, which eventually carry it to the coast. These nutrients supercharge the growth of algae, which bloom explosively, sometimes turning the water green or brown. When the algae die, they sink to the ocean floor where bacteria decompose them, a process that consumes oxygen. As oxygen levels drop below 2 milligrams per liter, most marine life can't survive. Fish flee if they can. Immobile creatures like clams and bottom-dwelling organisms suffocate and die. The ecosystem collapses. The Gulf of Mexico hosts the second-largest dead zone in the world, fueled primarily by fertilizer runoff from the Mississippi River watershed, an area covering 41% of the continental United States, including America's agricultural heartland. Every summer, the dead zone in the Gulf grows to roughly 6,000 to 8,000 square miles, an area larger than the state of New Jersey. This devastates the fishing industry. The Gulf provides roughly 40% of America's seafood, supporting a multi-billion-dollar industry and hundreds of thousands of jobs. As dead zones expand, fish populations decline, catches diminish, and fishing communities suffer. But the Gulf is just one example. Scientists have identified over 400 dead zones worldwide, and the number is growing. The Baltic Sea has a massive dead zone larger than the entire country of Denmark. The Chesapeake Bay, once one of America's most productive fisheries, suffers from recurring hypoxia. The East China Sea, the Northern Adriatic Sea, the Black Sea, dead zones are proliferating globally wherever intensive agriculture meets coastal waters. The largest dead zone in the world is in the Baltic Sea, spanning roughly 27,000 square miles. It's created by agricultural runoff from 9 countries bordering the Baltic, combined with discharge from sewage systems and industrial facilities. The sea's unique geography, shallow, semi-enclosed, with limited water exchange, makes it particularly vulnerable. In Southeast Asia, shrimp farming, an increasingly industrialized form of aquaculture, creates its own dead zones. Nutrient-rich waste from shrimp farms pollutes coastal waters, while the farms themselves often replace mangrove forests that once protected coastlines and nursed juvenile fish. The economic impacts are staggering. A study estimated that nutrient pollution costs the U.S. economy roughly $2.2 billion annually through impacts on fisheries, recreation, tourism, and property values. Globally, the costs run into the tens of billions. But the ecological costs are even more profound. Dead zones disrupt entire food webs. They create barriers that fragment fish populations. They alter predator-prey relationships. They can trigger shifts in species composition that persist even after oxygen levels recover. Some scientists worry about feedback loops. As dead zones expand, they can become more permanent features of coastal ecosystems rather than seasonal phenomena. Climate change exacerbates the problem. Warmer water holds less oxygen and increases the severity of hypoxia. Perhaps most disturbing is that dead zones represent just one manifestation of nutrient pollution. The same fertilizer runoff that creates ocean dead zones also causes harmful algal blooms that produce toxins dangerous to humans and wildlife. In freshwater lakes and reservoirs, excessive nutrients fuel blooms of cyanobacteria that can produce liver and nerve toxins. In 2014, roughly 500,000 residents of Toledo, Ohio, were warned not to drink or cook with tap water after a harmful algal bloom in Lake Erie contaminated the city's water supply. The bloom was fueled by agricultural runoff from surrounding farm fields. These problems aren't theoretical or distant. They're happening now, affecting real communities and real ecosystems. And they're getting worse. Walk through any supermarket in the developed world, and you're surrounded by abundance. Aisles stretch in every direction, packed with thousands of products from around the globe. Tropical fruits in winter. Fresh meat and dairy year-round. Processed foods engineered for maximum convenience and shelf life. The modern consumer is disconnected from the reality of food production in ways that would have been unimaginable to our great-grandparents. Most people couldn't tell you where their food was grown, how it was produced, or what environmental costs were embedded in its production. This disconnection is not accidental. It's the result of a food system that has become extraordinarily complex and globalized. The steak you buy might come from cattle raised in Brazil on deforested land, fed with soybeans grown in Iowa using fertilizer synthesized from natural gas in Louisiana, processed in a factory in Nebraska, and trucked to your city in refrigerated trailers. Every step of this journey has environmental costs, but they're externalized. meaning they're not reflected in the price you pay at the checkout counter. The true cost of that steak, the deforestation, the greenhouse gas emissions, the groundwater contamination, the dead zones in the Gulf, is paid by the environment and by future generations. Economists call these externalities. The industrial food system generates enormous negative externalities that don't appear on any company's balance sheet. Consider a typical industrial tomato operation in California. The farm uses synthetic fertilizers and pesticides, draws irrigation water from overexploited aquifers, relies on diesel-powered machinery, and ships its harvest across the country in refrigerated trucks. The environmental costs, pesticide exposure to farm workers, nitrate contamination of groundwater, methane emissions from decomposing organic waste, fossil fuel consumption, are all externalized. The tomato you buy is cheap, but only because someone else is paying the real cost. This creates a perverse economic incentive. Farmers who try to produce food more sustainably, using less fertilizer, protecting water quality, reducing emissions, face higher costs and can't compete with industrial operations that externalize environmental damage. The system rewards environmental destruction and punishes environmental stewardship. Breaking these invisible connections is essential to understanding the crisis. Your food choices, multiplied across millions of consumers, drive the industrial system that's devastating ecosystems worldwide. But here's the challenge: individual consumer choices alone can't solve systemic problems. The industrial food system is locked in by powerful economic forces, government subsidies, trade policies, and corporate power. In the United States, roughly $20 billion in agricultural subsidies flow primarily to large-scale producers of commodity crops: corn, soybeans, wheat, cotton. These subsidies make it economically rational for farmers to grow these crops intensively, using maximum chemical inputs to maximize yields. The same crops that fuel the industrial livestock system, processed food industry, and biofuel production. Meanwhile, fruit and vegetable farmers receive minimal support. This is why a pound of broccoli costs more than a fast food burger. The economic incentives are backward. The power of agribusiness corporations further entrenches the system. 4 companies control roughly 80% of the beef market in the United States. 3 companies control over 50% of global seed sales. The entire food system has consolidated into the hands of a small number of megacorporations that prioritize profit over environmental sustainability. These corporations spend hundreds of millions of dollars lobbying governments to maintain favorable policies and block regulations that would force them to internalize environmental costs. They fund think tanks and PR campaigns that cast doubt on scientific evidence of environmental damage. They sue journalists and activists who expose problems in the food system. The power imbalance is stark. On one side, multi-billion-dollar corporations with armies of lawyers and lobbyists. On the other, environmental advocates, small farmers trying to operate sustainably, and consumers trying to make informed choices. Yet change is possible. The food system wasn't always industrial, and it doesn't have to remain so. Throughout history, food systems have transformed in response to new knowledge, technologies, and social values. But transformation requires us to see the connections. To understand that the environmental crises we've explored, deforestation, water contamination, climate emissions, ocean dead zones, are not separate problems but interconnected symptoms of the same underlying system. A system designed without regard for ecological limits. A system optimized for short-term profit rather than long-term sustainability. A system that treats nature as an inexhaustible resource rather than a finite commons we must protect. Behind the statistics and scientific data are real people whose lives and livelihoods are being destroyed by industrial food production. In the Brazilian Amazon, indigenous leader Namonte Nenquimo has spent years fighting oil development and agricultural expansion into the ancestral territory of the Waorani people. They say they want to develop our lands, but development for whom? She asks. We have everything we need in the forest. When they destroy it, they destroy our way of life. The Waorani and hundreds of other indigenous groups across the Amazon have seen their territories invaded by cattle ranchers and soy farmers. Violence against indigenous people and environmental defenders has reached alarming levels. Between 2010 and 2020, over 1,500 people were killed in Brazil alone while defending forests and land rights. In Iowa, farmer George Naylor represents a different perspective, a family farmer trying to maintain sustainable practices in the heart of industrial agriculture. I've seen what the chemicals do, he explains. I've seen neighbors get sick from pesticide exposure. I've seen our waterways turn green with algae. But the economic pressure to farm like everyone else is immense. If I don't maximize yields like my neighbors, I can't make the mortgage payment. Naylor grows organic soybeans and corn, avoiding synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. But he's swimming against the tide. In Iowa, organic farms represent less than 1% of farmland. In the Philippines, marine biologist Dr. Angel Alcala has witnessed the destruction of coral reefs and fisheries due to agricultural runoff and industrial development. When I started my career 50 years ago, these waters were alive with fish and coral, he recalls. Now vast areas are dead or dying. The fertilizers from palm plantations wash into the sea and kill everything. In Punjab, India, Rajinder Kaur lost her husband to cancer, one of countless victims in a region with alarmingly high cancer rates linked to pesticide exposure and contaminated groundwater. Nobody told us the water was poisoned, she says. We drank it for years. My husband worked in the fields, handling the chemicals. Everyone said the Green Revolution would bring prosperity. They didn't mention it might kill us. These voices, indigenous leaders, farmers, scientists, affected communities, are often excluded from conversations about food policy. The people experiencing the consequences most directly have the least power to change the system. But they're also the ones leading resistance and imagining alternatives. Indigenous communities have protected roughly 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity, despite occupying just 22% of land globally. Their traditional agricultural practices, cultivating diverse crops, rotating fields, integrating livestock carefully into ecosystems, sustained civilizations for millennia without degrading the land. Small-scale farmers feeding their communities using agroecological methods demonstrate that productive agriculture doesn't require environmental destruction. Studies show that diversified farming systems can match or exceed industrial yields while building soil health, protecting water quality, and supporting biodiversity and accelerating. The knowledge exists, but despair accomplishes nothing. Are proven. The question is not whether the industrial will and economic incentive to support a transition. The question is how we transition to something better. This transition is already beginning in various forms around the world, driven by visionary farmers, scientists, entrepreneurs, activists, and policymakers who refuse to accept the status quo. Regenerative agriculture represents one promising approach. Rather than depleting soil, regenerative practices build soil health through cover cropping, minimal tillage, diverse crop rotations, and integration of animals. Healthy soil sequesters carbon, reducing atmospheric greenhouse gases. It absorbs and filters water, reducing contamination and erosion. It supports diverse microbial communities that make nutrients available to plants, reducing dependence on synthetic fertilizers. Farms implementing regenerative practices have demonstrated remarkable results. Soil carbon levels increase. Water retention improves. Yields stabilize or even increase over time. The farm becomes more resilient to climate extremes. Reducing food waste offers enormous potential. Roughly one-third of all food produced globally is lost or wasted, roughly 1.3 billion tons annually. This waste represents wasted land, water, energy, and chemicals used in production, plus methane emissions when organic waste decomposes in landfills. Cutting food waste in half would significantly reduce agriculture's environmental footprint. Dietary shifts could have massive impact. Animal products require far more land, water, and energy per calorie than plant-based foods. Beef is particularly resource-intensive. Producing 1 pound of beef requires roughly 20 pounds of grain and 1,800 gallons of water. If wealthy populations reduced meat consumption and shifted toward plant-based diets, it would free up vast amounts of agricultural land that could be reforested or converted to less intensive production. This doesn't necessarily mean everyone becoming vegan. Even modest reductions in meat consumption, particularly beef, could have significant benefits. And innovations in plant-based meat alternatives and cellular agriculture, growing meat from cells without raising animals, offer potential to satisfy demand while dramatically reducing environmental impact. Precision agriculture technologies allow farmers to apply inputs more efficiently. GPS-guided tractors, soil sensors, and drones enable targeted application of water, fertilizer, and pesticides, reducing waste and contamination while maintaining yields. Agroforestry integrates trees into agricultural landscapes, providing multiple benefits: carbon sequestration, windbreaks, improved water retention, habitat for beneficial insects and birds, and diversified income from timber, fruit, or nuts alongside traditional crops. Policy reforms could realign economic incentives. Redirecting subsidies away from industrial commodity production toward sustainable practices would help level the playing field. Carbon pricing that includes agriculture would force producers to internalize the cost of emissions. Stronger water quality regulations would reduce contamination. Support for small and medium-sized farms practicing sustainable agriculture could help them compete against industrial operations. Consumer awareness and demand for sustainably produced food is growing. Farmers markets, community-supported agriculture programs, and organic certification create market opportunities for farmers willing to embrace better practices. Every purchase is a vote for the kind of food system we want. International cooperation is essential. Deforestation, climate change, and ocean dead zones are global problems requiring coordinated global solutions. Protecting tropical forests means supporting sustainable development in countries that contain them. Reducing dead zones requires cooperation among all nations sharing watershed basins. Perhaps most importantly, we need to fundamentally rethink our relationship with food and with nature. The industrial mindset treats the natural world as a machine to be optimized for maximum output. But ecosystems are not machines. They're complex, interconnected living systems that require respect and careful management to maintain their health and productivity. Indigenous wisdom and traditional agricultural knowledge offer insights that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. Working with natural systems rather than against them. Valuing diversity over monoculture. Thinking in terms of cycles and relationships rather than linear inputs and outputs. The transition won't be easy. Powerful interests benefit from the current system and will resist change. The challenges are immense. Feeding a growing population while reducing agriculture's environmental footprint, creating economic opportunities for farmers transitioning to sustainable practices, overcoming the inertia of established infrastructure and supply chains. But the alternative is continuing on our current trajectory toward ecological collapse. And that's not an option. We've journeyed from the Amazon's vanishing rainforests to contaminated wells in Iowa, from industrial feedlots belching methane to dead zones spreading in the Gulf of Mexico. We've seen how the food system, that most fundamental human activity, has become a primary driver of environmental destruction. The scale of the crisis can feel overwhelming, and it should. This is an emergency. Every year we delay meaningful action, forests vanish, aquifers are depleted, greenhouse gases accumulate, and dead zones expand. But here's what you need to understand. This system was created by human choices. It can be transformed by human choices. Every meal is an opportunity to choose differently. Every farm that transitions to regenerative practices is a small victory. Every policy reform that supports sustainable agriculture is progress. Every acre of forest protected is a triumph. The industrial food system wants you to believe that feeding the world requires accepting environmental destruction as inevitable. That's a lie. We can feed humanity sustainably. We can produce abundant food while restoring forests, protecting water, stabilizing the climate, and reviving ocean ecosystems. But it requires us to see the true cost of our food, to demand transparency and accountability, to support farmers making better choices, to pressure policymakers to reform agricultural policies, to recognize that cheap food isn't cheap, we're paying for it with poisoned water, burning forests, and dying oceans. The choice before us is stark. Continue down the path of industrial agriculture toward ecological catastrophe, or transform our food system into something that nourishes both people and planet. Future generations will judge us by this choice. Children not yet born will inherit either a world where we had the courage to change course, or a devastated planet where we knew the damage we were causing and chose profit over preservation. The rainforests still standing need protection. The aquifers still clean need safeguarding. The oceans still alive need healing. And the farmers trying to do the right thing need support. This is not someone else's problem. This is everyone's responsibility. The environmental crisis created by industrial food production affects every person on Earth. And every person has agency, however small, to be part of the solution. The question is not whether change is possible. It's whether we have the collective will to demand it and the courage to see it through. The future of food, and the future of the planet, hangs in the balance. What we do next will determine which future we get.